The temperature does not warn you. One moment you are breathing, and the next, your lungs seize violently against air, so cold it feels as if you have swallowed a cup of shattered glass. In the late autumn of 1881, Dmitry Voronov stood on the threshold of the vast, open Mongolian steppe, watching the horizon dissolve into a pale, shifting haze. He was a geographer of the Russian Empire, a man whose mind was shaped by the rigid order of textbooks and the solid brick architecture of St. Petersburg. To him, the wilderness was not an indomitable force, but a problem waiting for a one-civilised civilized solution. Behind him sat his proudest achievement, a newly completed wooden brick outpost. The walls were constructed of double-thickness, imported pine, packed with dry sawdust, and braced with heavy iron bolts. The windows were fitted with expensive double-pane glass, and a massive brick chimney rose from the center, connected to a heavy cast-iron stove. Dmitry pulled his heavy sable coat tighter around his shoulders, his breath instantly freezing into a white crust on his collar. He checked his thermometer, watching the mercury retract to a staggering 48 degrees below zero. Man cannot survive out here without a solid barrier between himself and the barrier. Sky, he muttered to his assistant, pointing toward the nomadic encampment visible on the distant ridge. There, a handful of round, wool-covered yurts sat like tiny pale mushrooms against the vast gray grass of the plateau. To Dmitry's educated eye, those structures were flimsy, archaic, and dangerously primitive. They were nothing more than baskets of willow twigs wrapped in sheep's wool, completely lacking the heavy timber, stone foundations, or brick chimneys that civil engineer manuals deemed essential for winter survival. He was convinced that the nomads stayed there out of sheer stubborn ignorance, refusing to adopt the superior architectural methods of the modern world. "We have stored 10 cords of cured birchwood," Dmitry said, his voice carrying the calm assurance of a man who believed science could conquer any climate. "We have double-glazed windows and airtight doors. Let the Siberian wind blow as hard as it pleases. We have built a fortress that will force this frozen plateau into absolute submission." He looked back at the distant yurts, pitying the families who lived inside them. He believed they would spend the coming months huddled in misery, while his own outpost would stand as a warm monument to human progress. The cold deepened as Dmitry and his 2 armed guards made a final ride across the steppe to survey the terrain. The wind was a low, persistent hum that never seemed to rest, carrying a fine, icy dust that stung the eyes. As they neared the ridge, they encountered the nomadic herder family who had chosen this stretch of pasture for their winter camp. The elder herder, Bayan, was a man whose face was etched with the deep lines of 50 Mongolian winters. Beside him stood his daughter Altana, who was quietly securing a horse to a wooden tether. What struck Dmitry immediately was the big contrast between his own men and these steppe dwellers. Dmitry's guards were shivering violently, their bodies stiff and hunched despite their thick, heavy European coats. Their gloved hands shook as they held the reins, and their faces were pinched with misery. Bayan and Altana, however, moved with an easy, fluid grace. They wore long, sheepskin coats called deals, which wrapped generously around their bodies and were tied at the waist with thick silk sashes. Their movements were relaxed, their breathing steady, as if the bitter cold were nothing more than a gentle autumn breeze. Bayan looked at Dmitry's heavy, rigid clothing, and then pointed toward the Persichin, distant timber outpost. "The winter is coming down from the north, traveler," Bayan said through an interpreter, his voice calm and unhurried. "Your house is beautiful, but it stands in the throat of the wind. You have built it where the wind valley narrows, where the cold air is squeezed and forced to run fast. The wind will slide over our round tents, but it will fight your flat walls." Dmitry smiled, a polite but condescending expression. "My walls are 2 feet thick," Bayan, he replied, gesturing toward the horizon. They are built of solid Russian pine, braced with heavy iron. We have a stove that can burn hot, enough to melt lead. We do not fear the wind, because we have built a structure that can resist it. Altana looked up from her work, her dark eyes reflecting the pale winter sun. You cannot resist the steppe, traveler, she said softly. You can only understand it. The wind does not care how strong your wood is. It only wants to find the heat and carry it away. Dmitri did not appreciate being lectured by people who had never read a treatise on thermodynamics. He thanked Bayan for his concern, but politely declined the invitation to move his base of operations into the lee of the southern hills, where the nomadic family was preparing their camp. Our work requires us to maintain a clear line of sight across the northern One-Less Valley, Dmitri explained, adjusting his leather cap. We must remain where we can observe the transit of the stars and the movement of the terrain. We cannot hide behind the hills. Bayan nodded slowly, his expression carrying no anger, only a quiet, patient understanding. Every man must choose his own ground, the elder said, but the cold is not an enemy. You can shoot with a rifle or lock out with a door. It is a presence. It is the breath of the earth when the sun is away. Dmitri rode back to his outpost, his mind already turning to the evening's work. He viewed the nomads' nomadic lifestyle as a tragic, disorganized struggle against an environment they simply did not know how to tame. If you enjoy these stories of survival and the clash of traditional wisdom against the modern world, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We bring you real, historically grounded narratives every week. By nightfall, the nomadic camp had completed its relocation, disappearing behind the fold of the southern hills. Dmitri's outpost stood alone on the exposed ridge, a dark, rectangular silhouette against the pale, snow-dusted grass. Inside, the cast-iron stove was fired, its heat radiating quickly through the main room. Dmitri sat at his desk, writing his reports by the warm light of a kerosene lamp, completely satisfied with his choice. They live like animals because they do not understand how to build, Dmitri wrote in his journal, his hands steady and warm. They rely on wool and luck, while we rely on wood, brick, and the laws of modern engineering. This winter will prove that the future belongs to those who build to conquer the earth. Outside, the wind began to rise, a high, thin whistle that pressed against the double-pane glass of his window. Behind the southern hills, where the wind was reduced to a steady, predictable breeze, Bayan and Altana began the construction of their winter camp. The One-Less process was organized and methodical, requiring no blueprints or measuring tapes, yet executed with a mathematical precision that had been refined over 2.5 millennia. They began by clearing a circle of earth, precisely 22 feet in diameter. Altana laid out the wooden lattice wall sections, known as kana. These walls were made of light, flexible willow wood, split into thin strips, and pinned together at their intersections with leather thongs. When expanded, the lattice formed a perfect circle, a geometry that offered no flat surfaces for the wind to strike. The circle is the shape of the sky, Bayan explained to his grandchildren as they helped lift the frame. A square corner is a trap. It catches the wind, holds it, and lets it tear at the wood. But a round wall lets the wind slide past, like water flowing around a smooth stone in the river. This was not mere poetry, it was fluid dynamics. By eliminating flat walls and sharp corners, the yurt minimized its drag coefficient, allowing even gale force winds to pass over the structure with minimal resistance. This prevented the localized high-pressure zones that actively scour heat off flat-walled buildings. At the top of the lattice walls, Altana secured the heavy woven wool tension bands. These bands ran the entire circumference of the structure. When the roof, poles, or uni were inserted into the central crown ring, tonneau, and connected to the walls. The downward weight of the roof was converted into outward tension. The woven bands resisted this force, converting it into compressive hoop stress that clamped the entire structure together. The more weight that pressed down on the roof, whether from accumulated snow or the force of the wind, the more tightly the walls clamped inward. The yurt was an interconnected structure that automatically stiffened and stabilized itself under the very environmental pressures that would collapse a standard wood frame house. It was a self-supporting dome that required no internal pillars or heavy, load-bearing beams. With the wooden frame secured, the family began the process of wrapping the structure in its protective skin. This skin was made of felt, a material whose insulation properties remain extraordinary, even by the standards of modern material science. Felt is not woven. It is a dense, unified mat of compressed sheep's wool. Earlier in the autumn, the entire nomadic community had gathered for the felt-making process. The wool from their sheep was sheared, cleaned, and spread evenly over a large, flat sheet of canvas. It was wetted with warm water, sprinkled with whey, and then rolled tightly around a heavy wooden pole. The plan roll was wrapped in old, worn felt for protection, lashed with leather ropes, and tied to the saddle of a horse. Altana had ridden that horse for hours across the steppe, dragging the heavy cylinder behind her at a steady gallop. The constant, repetitive pounding against the earth forced the microscopic scales on the wool fibers to expand and interlock, transforming the loose wool into a dense, uniform sheet of felt that was nearly an inch thick. Dmitri had watched this process through his telescope weeks before, viewing it as a primitive, disorganized spectacle. He could not understand why these people spent hours riding horses in circles just to make sheets of matted wool when they could have purchased proper timber from the trading posts. What Dmitri did not understand was that compressed felt contains millions microscopic, dead air pockets trapped between the interlocked wool fibers. These air pockets resist heat transfer with incredible effectiveness, creating a thermal barrier that is both lightweight and highly flexible. For the winter camp, Bayan unrolled 4 layers of this heavy felt over the winter camp wooden frame, overlapping the panels to ensure there were no gaps. Over the felt, they tied a canvas cover treated with sheep's fat to make it water-resistant. The result was a thick, seamless envelope that was completely airtight. Dmitri's outpost relied on thickness and mass to resist the cold, but the yurt relied on trapped air and flexibility. It was a structure that did not fight the environment. It insulated itself from it. The final details of the yurt's construction highlighted the fundamental difference between Dmitri's engineering and Bayan's traditional wisdom. As Dmitri watched through his glass, he noticed that the nomads did not use a single metal nail, bolt, or screw in their construction. To Dmitri, this was the ultimate proof of their technological backwardness. A structure without iron cannot stand, he told his assistant. It has no rigidity. It is nothing more than a pile of twigs held together by string. What Dmitri's engineering manuals failed to mention was the behavior of iron in extreme cold. At temperatures below 40 degrees, cast iron and steel become highly brittle. The constant vibration of the wind can cause metal fasteners to develop microfractures, eventually snapping under sudden loads. Furthermore, metal is an exceptional thermal conductor. Every iron bolt that penetrates a wooden wall acts as a thermal bridge, drawing heat out of the interior and creating a cold spot where frost can accumulate. Bayan's structure used joints made of wet camel hide. When applied wet, the hide strips were wrapped tightly around the wooden intersections and left to dry. As they dried, the hide shrunk, clamping the wood with a force that rivaled iron, but retaining its natural elasticity even at -50, circ. Text C. When the fierce winter winds struck the yurt, the structure did not resist, Rigidly, it flexed. The camel hide joints absorbed the energy of the wind, allowing the frame to shift slightly and dissipate the force throughout the force. Entire circular lattice. If you want to discover more about these forgotten, highly efficient survival techniques that saved lives across history, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to share these remarkable narratives. With the yurt fully assembled and insulated, Bayan set the heavy wooden door into the south-facing frame. The door was covered with a thick, double-layer felt flap that functioned as a gasket, sealing the entrance against drafts. The winter camp was ready. The structure was complete, and the family moved their camp belongings inside, prepared for whatever the sky would bring. Inside the yurt, the atmosphere was surprisingly quiet. The constant, high-pitched whistle of the steppe wind was reduced to a soft, muffled murmur as it passed over the curved felt roof. But the most remarkable aspect of the roof prostis interior was not the quiet. It was the quality of the air. Wool felt is a highly hygroscopic material, meaning it possesses a natural capacity to absorb and release water vapor from the air. In any closed winter, shelter, human respiration, cooking steam, and drying gear quickly saturate the basin air with moisture. In Dimitri's outpost, this moisture condensed on the cold Kinavax ply, windows, and log walls, freezing into thick sheets of ice that actively drew N40N warmth out of the room. In Bayan's yurt, the dry felt walls functioned as a thorough, passive climate control system. As the humidity inside the structure rose, the inner layers of felt absorbed the excess water vapor directly from the air. This process of absorption was not merely passive, it was exothermic. When wool fibers absorb water molecules, the chemical bond releases kinetic energy in the form of heat, a physical phenomenon known as heat absorption. A single kilogram of dry wool can release a significant amount of thermal energy as it absorbs moisture from a humid room. With dozens of kilograms of felt wrapping the yurt, the walls functioned as an active, self-regulating heating element. The moisture from the family's breath and cooking steam was not a nuisance. It was the fuel for a chemical reaction that generated constant, gentle warmth throughout the night. As the air dried, the felt held the moisture safely within its fibers. During ADSNs and the day, when the sun warmed the exterior canvas, or when the central stove was burning hot, the felt slowly released the moisture back into the atmosphere, maintaining a stable, healthy humidity level that prevented the dry skin, throat, irritation, and respiratory issues that plagued people living in conventional bare cabins. It was an elegant, interconnected system that required no energy input, no maintenance, and no moving parts. The house itself was alive, breathing in moisture and breathing out warmth, maintaining human comfort through the physics of its materials. In the center of the yurt sat the stove, a simple iron cylinder with a flat top for cooking. Its stovepipe ran straight up through the center of the tonneau, the wooden crown ring that formed the apex of the roof. On the treeless steppe, there were no pine forests or birch groves to supply wood. Dimitri's outpost relied on 10 cords of cured birchwood, hauled at great expense from the northern valleys. But Bayan's family used a far more abundant, local fuel: argol, the dry dung of their livestock. Altana had spent the late summer collecting the dung from the pens, where the animals were kept at night. The constant trampling of sheep, goats, and cattle compressed the waste into dense, highly compacted layers. Once cut into blocks and dried in the sun, argol lost all odor, becoming as hard and dense as coal. "The earth gives us everything we need, traveler," Bayan would say to his children. "The grass feeds the sheep give us the wool for our home, and the argol for our fire. Nothing is wasted." Argol possessed an energy density that rivaled lignite coal, burning with a slow, smoldering intensity that produced steady, reliable heat. Unlike birchwood, which burns hot and fast. Requiring constant attention, argol smoldered for hours, releasing its thermal energy at a controlled, even rate that was perfectly matched to the insulation value of the felt walls. The draft of the stove was entirely self-regulating. The massive temperature difference between the fire inside the stove and the -50 circ text C air outside created a powerful natural draft. As cold air was drawn in through the small gaps around the south-facing door, it was pulled across the floor, heated by the stove, and then rose to the ceiling. This created a highly organized convection loop. The rising warm air struck the curved ceiling, rolled down the felt walls, and warmed the sleeping areas before being drawn back into the stove's intake. The system required no fans, no mechanical dampers, and no adjustments. The fire managed its own oxygen supply, maintaining a steady, clean burn through the longest winter nights, while using a fraction of the fuel of Dimitri's modern cast-iron stove. The final layer of the winter survival system was the livestock itself. Bayan did not view his animals merely as assets to be sold or processed. They were an active part of the camp's thermal defense. Each evening, Altana and her brothers drove their herd of sheep and goats into the central courtyard created by the circular arrangement of the yurts. The animals clustered together tightly, their bodies pressing against one another to conserve heat. 100 sheep generate a significant amount of collective body heat through their normal metabolic processes. Clustered within the windbreak of the yurt ring, their combined thermal output raised the ambient temperature of the courtyard by several degrees. The herd formed a living barrier of warm, still air that shielded the lower portions of the yurts from the cold ground winds. The wind that did manage to penetrate the outer ring of the camp was warmed by the animals' bodies before it reached the yurt doors. On the coldest nights, when the wind threatened to freeze the youngest animals, Altana brought the newborn lambs and kids inside the yurt. They were positioned in a designated area near the south-facing door, where the cold air entered. Their presence added another layer of warmth. The young animals' body heat warmed the incoming draft before it reached the family's sleeping area. It was a closed-loop system where every element served multiple functions. The animals provided the wool for the walls, the fuel for the stove, and the warmth for the forcement air, while the family provided the shelter and protection that kept the herd alive. Dimitri's outpost sat isolated on the ridge, fighting the cold with brute force and imported fuel. But Bayan's camp lived in a holistic, highly organized relationship with the steppe, utilizing the natural energy of the landscape to maintain human life through the deepest freeze. They had no need for firewood because they had understood how to live within the thermal limits of the steppe itself. The crisis arrived in the second week of January, not with a sudden drop in temperature, but with an unexpected warmth. A warm, wet wind blew down from the Blan southern mountains, pushing the thermometer up into the high 20s. To an inexperienced observer, this was a welcome relief. The thick snowpack began to soften, turning to slush on the roofs of the cabins and the grass of the steppe. Dmitry Voronov stood on the porch of his outpost, watching the water drip from the eaves. "The winter is breaking," his assistant said, smiling. "We have used less wood than we expected." But Dimitri's geographer training carried a warning. He had read accounts of the Prizens, steppe's seasonal anomalies, but he had never experienced one. In Mongolia, this sudden warmth was known as the prelude to the dzud, the natural disaster that has devastated herds and claimed human lives for centuries. By afternoon, the southern wind died, replaced by an eerie, breathless silence. The sky took on a pale greenish-gray color, and the barometer began a rapid, precipitous drop. Altana, standing in the courtyard of her camp, looked at the sky and then at the Prussian 7. Damp ground. "The ice is coming," she said to her father. "The grass will be sealed." By nightfall, the Siberian wind returned with a ferocity that made the previous Storms seemed gentle. The temperature did not drop gradually. It plummeted 40 degrees in less than 3 hours, eventually settling at a shattering 51 degrees below zero. The slush that had covered the steppe froze instantly, turning into an XB1 impenetrable sheet of solid ice that encased the grass 3 inches deep. This was the Iron Zood, the most dreaded of all steppe disasters. Inside Dimitri's outpost, the wood frame walls began to groan and pop as the timber contracted rapidly under the sudden, extreme cold. The iron bolts that held the beams together groaned under the immense tension, micro-fractures forming in the brittle metal as the structure fought to hold its shape against the freezing air. The test had begun. The Siberian wind struck Dimitri's outpost with a velocity of 50 miles per hour, pushing the wind chill down to 70 degrees below zero. The flat, vertical walls of his pine cabin took the full force of the gale, creating a massive convective cooling effect that stripped heat off the exterior timber as fast as the cast iron stove could generate it. Dimitri fired the stove hard, throwing on log after log of his cured birch. But he quickly ran into a catastrophic problem: his firewood supply. The firewood was stored in an outdoor wooden shed, protected only by a canvas tarp. During the false thaw, the melting snow had saturated the top layers of the wood pile. When the temperature plummeted, this moisture froze solid, encasing his remaining logs in a thick sheet of ice. The wood was ice-logged, heavy, and damp. When Dimitri threw a log into the stove, it did not burn hot. It hissed and steamed, producing more smoke than flame. The energy of the fire was spent, boiling off the water trapped inside the wood rather than heating the cabin. The temperature inside the outpost began a steady, terrifying drop, falling to 41 degrees, then 35, then 30. Frost began to form on the blant inside of the double-pane windows, thick as a finger, blocking all outside light. Worse, the extreme cold caused the moisture from their breath to condense on the blanket interior log walls, freezing into a slick sheet of ice that acted as a cold sink, drawing even more warmth out of the room. Dimitri's guards huddled near the bronze stove, wrapped in blankets, their teeth chattering. Then the chimney failed. The wet wood had produced massive amounts of creosote, which condensed and froze inside the cold brick flue, blocking the draft. Thick, suffocating smoke began to pour from the stove door, filling the cabin with an acrid haze that made them choke. Dimitri was forced to extinguish the Bashan's Antevan fire entirely to prevent suffocation. The cabin was now an ice cage, completely defenseless against the firster. -50. Circ, text, C, air that pressed against its groaning walls from every direction. With no fire, no dry wood, and a cabin filled with freezing smoke, Dimitri knew they could not survive the night. "We must go to the nomads," he gasped, his fruinate voice raspy from the smoke. "They have shelter." His assistant looked at him in terror. "In this? We won't make it 100 yards. We have no choice," Dimitri said, pulling his sable coat over his head. "We stay here, and we d." They stumbled out into the whiteout, roped together to prevent separation in the whiteout, blinding snow. The wind was a solid wall of ice that knocked them down, freezing, their breath instantly on their eyes. Dimitri could not see the path, could not see his hand before his face, could not breathe without wrapping his wool scarf tight over his mouth. He moved by blang instinct, following the slope of the ridge down toward the southern hills. Twice, one of his guards fell, unable to stand against the force of the wind, and twice Dimitri had to haul him up through the deep drifts. Their bodies were stiffening, their limbs losing sensation as hypothermia began its quiet, deadly to work. Just as Dimitri felt his legs give way, he saw a dim, warm glow ahead. It was the Yurt camp, nestled in the depression of the hills. The wind was suddenly reduced, its force deflected over the camp by the southern slope. He stumbled toward the nearest yurt and pounded on the wooden door. The door opened instantly. Altana stood there, her sheepskin deal warm and dry. She pulled them inside, closing the door and sealing the felt flap behind them. The transition was immediate and profound. Dmitri stepped from a screaming, freezing void of 70 below, wind chill into a silent, clean, and blissful 20 degrees Celsius haven. The air was warm, dry, and smelled of wood smoke and tea. He fell to his knees. On the thick felt carpet, his body shaking violently as the warmth began to thaw, his frozen limbs. He was alive. Dmitri awoke the next morning to the sound of soft breathing. He lay on a thick, wool-felt mattress, covered with sheepskin coats that were warm and dry. His fingers and toes ached as the circulation returned, but they were uninjured. He looked around the yurt. The space was compact, orderly, and bathed in a soft, natural light that entered through the tonneau, the wooden crown ring at the apex. A moderate fire smoldered in the central stove, burning blocks of argil with a quiet, steady intensity that produced no smoke. The air was comfortable, holding steady at 18 degrees Celsius. There was no frost on the walls, no condensation dripping from the ceiling, no drafts of cold air whistling through seams. Altana was quietly preparing a pot of milk tea, her movements calm, methodical. She looked at Dmitri and smiled, handing him a warm bowl. As Dmitri drank the tea, he noticed a sharp shaft of sunlight entering through the tonneau. The sunbeam struck the west-facing lattice wall, creating a bright circle of light against the dark wood. Bayan sat nearby, watching the sunbeam with a quiet, patient expression. He pointed to the circle of light. "The sun is at the hour of the sheep. Traveler," Bayan said through the interpreter, "it is time to check the horses." Dmitri checked his pocket watch. It read exactly 10 o'clock. He watched the Dida's sunbeam move slowly, predictably across the diamond pattern of the willow lattice, dividing the day into animal hours corresponding to its position. The yurt itself was a giant timekeeping instrument, its geometry calibrated to the rotation of the earth and the passage of the sun. Dmitri sat in silence, his geographer's mind running through the implications of what he was seeing. The people he had called primitive, the structure he had dismissed as a flimsy basket of wool, had actually solved the most complex problems of cold weather architecture. They had done it without double glazing, without brick chimneys, without 10 cords of imported birchwood, and without a single iron bolt. They had used geometry to defeat the wind, chemistry to generate heat from moisture, and animal waste to fuel a self-regulating fire. It was the most elegant, efficient, and sophisticated survival system Dmitri had ever seen, and it had been operating on this plateau for 3,000 years. By afternoon, the wind finally began to die, its high-pitched howl reducing to a soft sigh. Across the felt roof, Dmitri stood up, his body still sore from the one-tree action, cold, and walked to the door. He stepped outside into the courtyard. The sun was low, casting long blue shadows across the sparkling ice that covered the steppe. Dmitri's timber outpost was visible in the distance, a dark, rigid silhouette on frayed end can. The ridge. Through his telescope, he could see that the porch roof had collapsed, under the weight of the wet snow from the false thaw, and a thick sheet of ice covered the north-facing walls. The brick chimney was cracked, a dark line of soot running down the pine logs, where the draft had failed. The fortress of progress was a frozen tomb. Dmitri returned to the yurt, sat beside Bayan, and bowed his head. "I owe you an Enafri Tim." "Apology, Bayan," Dmitri said quietly, his voice carrying the deep humility of a Parthian man who had been thoroughly schooled by reality. "I called your home primitive. I thought our science was superior. I believed we could force this step to submit." Bayan placed his hand on Dmitri's shoulder, his touch warm and firm. "The steppe does not care for pride, traveler," the elder said. "It does not care for books or iron. It only cares for truth. You built your house to fight the wind, so the wind fought you. We built our home to live with the wind, so the wind became our shield. Altana looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. The cold is not an enemy, Dmitri. It is a presence. When you fight it, you spend your life burning wood just to stay alive. But when you understand it, you can sleep in peace while the sky freezes. Dmitri nodded slowly, the lesson settling deep into his mind. This was not a defeat. It was a reconciliation. He had been saved not by force, but by wisdom. And that wisdom was something he would carry for the rest of his life. When the spring winds finally returned, melting the thick sheet of ice and turning the steppe back into a vibrant ocean of green grass, the winter camp came down. Dmitri Voronov stood in the courtyard, watching Bayan and Altana dismantle their yurts. The willow frames were collapsed into neat bundles of lattice. The felt panels were rolled and secured with wool ropes. The central stoves were cleaned and loaded onto the backs of two sturdy camels. Within an hour, the entire camp had vanished, leaving no trace of its existence. On the greening pasture, Dmitri returned to St. Petersburg that summer, but he was not the same man who had left. He did not present his geographical surveys as a chronicle of Russian dominance over a primitive wilderness. Instead, he published a detailed architectural and physical study of the yurt, presenting it to the Imperial Geographical Society as a masterpiece of thermodynamic and aerodynamic engineering. His reports challenged the very definition of advanced civilization, forcing scholars to reconsider how humans should adapt to extreme climates. If this story has changed your perspective on traditional wisdom and the power of quiet, practical competence over modern complexity, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing these remarkable, forgotten lessons from history. Dmitri spent the rest of his career advocating for earth shelter designs, passive solar principles, and the integration of traditional materials in cold weather engineering. His books were read by a new generation of builders who began incorporating these timeless principles into modern, energy-efficient architecture. But for Dmitri, the true reward was not the academic recognition, it was the memory of a warm yurt on a 47 below zero night, the smell of milk tea, and the quiet sunrise of a wisdom that had survived the steppe for 3,000 years. When the spring thaw finally came, Dmitri's proud timber outpost was found abandoned, its structural beams split by the frost and its chimney choked with ice. The building, designed to defy the steppe, had been broken by it. In contrast, Bayan's yurt camp was packed onto camels within an hour, leaving no trace of its existence on the greening pasture. The families moved on, following the grass, carrying their warmth and their wisdom to the next valley. Dmitri Voronov spent the rest of his years teaching a simple truth, that real advancement is not measured by the weight of our stone walls, but by our willingness to listen to the people who survived before us. For on the frozen plains, humility is the only shield that never breaks.